Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamor.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Brett Davies. He is the author of a new book in the Refocus series called The Films of Lawrence Kasdan, the director of The Big Chill, Body Heat, and the screenwriter of Raiders of the Lost Ark and X-Back, among many others. Just a note to say that I have been obviously very busy over the summer with festivals. I've tried to keep up a weekly episode, but obviously that hasn't been possible the whole time. I still have a couple of festivals to do, Locarno and Venice, and I will be doing reports from those festivals for the podcast. But if you have some patience with me, I will also be proposing old episodes from the archives, because we've got several years' worth that you might not have had the opportunity to listen to. So hopefully you won't mind going back and having a listen to some of those until normal service can be resumed. But I'm delighted to say that Brett Davies is here, is a new episode, is completely original, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. How did you initially become attracted to this filmmaker to the extent that you wanted to write a book?
That's always one of those questions. Was one of the most difficult questions to answer when I was first kind of formulating it. It was originally a PhD thesis, and the reason it was hard to answer wasn't because I don't have good reasons, but I just had too many reasons why I wanted to study him further. And I think the main thing, I guess I can kind of pare it down to two points. One is kind of the emotional point, which is when I was a kid, I'm very much of the Star Wars generation. I grew up with those films, with Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I was kind of one of those geeky kids who liked to see how it was made and bought all the making of books and watched the making of documentaries. The name Lawrence Kasdan just kept coming up as screenplay by, and I even had the Raiders of the Lost Ark illustrated screenplay. Well, in fact, my brother had it, but we both read it, again and again. So it was always in my mind. And then as I got older, I saw that he made these other films as well as a director. And he's at the time, these grown-up films, which didn't seem as interesting to me. But then, of course, when I grew up, I watched Big Chill, Bodyguard, Grand Canyon, and it kind of just occurred to me, it's a really interesting career that he had, this very popular career, but also making the kind of state of the nation, very American films of the 80s and 90s. Then I guess it was really in 2015 when Force Awakens was coming out, and of course Kasdan was back writing Star Wars, and that was at the time when I was formulating my PhD, and it just brought back to mind the fact that, oh yeah, here's this guy I always admired, and looking at his career, just thinking, on the one hand, he's this screenwriter, Raiders, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Bodyguard, which I think people forget what a big deal that was, at the time. But on the other hand, he's this director of really quite important films like Big Chill, Bodyguard, Grand Canyon, that really sort of represented that generation, I guess. I think Rotten Tomatoes starts the biography, the archetypal baby boomer, but I think perhaps because he had these two kind of simultaneous careers, I think it kind of confused critics a little. I mean, there's nothing, no other books have been written about him compared to, say Barry Levinson or even Nancy Myers or Robert Zemeckis. And I think people struggle to know where to put him because, as I say, on the one hand, he wrote these very popular movies, but then also was making quite personal, very contemporary films. So yeah, I just kind of delved a little deeper and began to hypothesize that critics were a bit confused by it. And also, I think it was interesting that in the Lucasfilm films that he contributed to, his name was just never mentioned in reviews, in most articles about them. But then in reviews for the Big Chill or Body Heat, etc., it would always say the Star Wars screenwriter, the Raiders screenwriter. And I wondered if there was a little bit of snobbery there as well, that people didn't like the fact that this popular screenwriter was now trying to make these grown-up films, possibly. So my starting point really was, this is someone who deserves to be recognized for one strand of his career and the other strand, but perhaps because he had two strands, that critics weren't giving him his due, perhaps. So that was my starting point, and I guess I set out to not necessarily to say, yes, look, he absolutely deserves it, but I set out to investigate further and to see if he does, more credit or more accolades, I guess, as the exemplar of 80s, 90s, turn of the century.
It's a very convincing argument in the book that you make, and especially that idea, because I'd never sort of thought, well, yeah, I'm guilty of the same thing. I kind of never really thought of him as this of connecting those two things of these films, which I mean, I greatly admire Body Heat, The Big Chill, great movies, and these other films which I absolutely love and adore, from childhood on, Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Wars. And you sort of think of them as it's the same person. It's the same person putting pen to paper. And there are plenty of filmmakers who have done that, who've done entertainment and also serious films and autobiographical films. And yet I mean, Charlie Chaplin could be used as a template for that. So it's really convincing. When did you? Because you finished the book with a long interview, and you obviously use Kasdan himself as a source throughout the book. When did you first approach him, and what was his reaction to your? Because I mean, he must not be used to people wanting to write books about him.
It was actually quite near the end. I decided very deliberately not to get in touch earlier on because I didn't want my critiques of him and his films to be too affected by possibly getting to know him better, and really I wanted to investigate myself first, and then hopefully find out more and to shade some of those areas that perhaps I hadn't covered as much. So I got in touch. Actually, originally I did try at the end of my PhD, but it was when he was making Light and Magic and just wasn't available. And then I tried again when I was doing the book, and that time we eventually got in touch through his assistant. And yeah, he seemed, I think, pleased, interested. He actually asked the same question that you asked. Why? Why are you writing about me? And that was one time when I really first started thinking, oh yeah, why was it? But of course, for the reasons I said is why. And yeah, and so he was interested. But of course, I think also he was aware to some extent that, people are interested. And I think that's something, I guess you could call it zeitgeist, that there have been a few retrospectives in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. He's appeared on Script Notes, the screenwriting podcast with John August and Craig Mazin, done a couple of interviews on there. He had a long interview, which very kindly he sent me, because it wasn't released yet, from the Academy. And Jim Hemphill had interviewed him just a few months previous to my interview for the Academy, for their archives. So I think there's perhaps a sense generally that, oh yeah, this is someone who is to be listened to, or someone to be celebrated. And so perhaps he certainly wasn't conceited at all. He was very, very humble, very, very kind, thoughtful man. But I think there is a sense that perhaps there is a little groundswell of people beginning to appreciate what he has done.
We go back to his beginning, because I not knowing that much about him, and it was really interesting to see him as this sort of product of, to some degree, there was his parents divorced, and that he was in between two worlds, sort of geographically. I think you'll correct me, please, if I'm wrong, but I think it was Miami, and then one of the central states, southern
West Virginia.
West Virginia, that's right, yes. And then when he went to university, I was also quite interested in how he talks about 60s radicalism, because that also becomes a big influence for the Big Chill. I'm always interested about how that sort of radicalism and that sort of political awareness is linked to those sort of coming out of new Hollywood impulses as well. Maybe you could tell us a bit about his background and how he got into cinema and how he got into the start of his career.
Yeah, so as you say, his family moved around a little younger, between Florida and West Virginia, and certainly seemed to feel a certain amount of uncertainty, I think, as his family did move, as his parents divorced. His father passed away when I think he was 14. So, of course, it wasn't an easy childhood. And I think he did say in the interview with me that his mother wasn't an easy person, or wasn't a fun person. I think he said that. So it seemed like quite a difficult childhood, but he really found his refuge in writing. He wrote in his later, when they kind of settled, he wrote for the school newspaper, and he said that's when he found kind of oh wow, I can write things and people are interested. And that really led him to studying at Michigan, where there was the Hopwood Awards, quite a prestigious writing awards at the time. And to give his mother her due, apparently she, I think Kasdan's words, she preached the religion of writing. And so, clearly it was a house where, even if it wasn't full of writers, it was, people understood and got the concept of being a writer. Certainly in terms of films, his older brother, Mark, he took him to see Lawrence of Arabia, which was a huge influence, Magnificent Seven as well, and then Seven Samurai. And so those films kind of inspired him. But he said he didn't really know about the idea of being a screenwriter, perhaps only really fully formed, as far as I can tell, when he went to university. And while he was there, then he started writing as well as theatrical plays, I believe, and also fiction. And from there, he won these Hopwood Awards. He won a couple, actually, of Hopwood, a big deal, apparently. Mm-hmm. He said that from that day on, he never doubted himself. He always knew he would make it as a writer. So, and in terms of kind of the political bent, clearly he's left-leaning or progressive. I'm not sure how involved he was in terms of very radical politics. I mean, he said he was, Michigan was at the very center of lots of the radicalism, like the Weathermen. But I think he said that he was kind of, he was around it, but wasn't necessarily complete. But of course, it was very much part of his growing up, and I think it really did affect then things like even Body Heat, the first film he directed, which about someone who has kind of had a fairly easy life post-college, but also what he would regard as a not very meaningful life. And I think after university for Kasdan, he ended up going into advertising, which he didn't love. He was quite successful in that as well. He won a Clio Award for advertising, but he didn't love it and was still on a write screenplay and feeling frustrated. And I think he said it was in total, it would have been about 7-8 years of writing screenplays with success, and eventually moving to Hollywood. But but as an advertiser. But he just knew that if he and his young family went there, he would have more chance being in Los Angeles. And eventually he did sell. The Bodyguard was the first one he sold, even though it wasn't made for another 13, 14 years. As I say, it was the politics of his college years probably most affected his. I would say most, certainly his earlier films as director, like The Beach Hill. So I mean, these were University of Michigan students, and of course, then it resonated then through his career.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting that he's done such a long apprenticeship, and I think it's also the thing about The Bodyguard. People always have this thing of saying, "Oh, this film took 10 years or 15 years or 20 years to." That's so much the norm. I feel that it's not. I've read that in so many books and so many interviews that I've talked to people, and they're like, "Oh, well, the original screenplay was written back in 1993, and it's 2023, and we're making it now." It's just like, yeah, that's how it works. It's
yeah, true.
So, in a way, although he sold The Bodyguard and he sold another script, Continental
Divide. Continental Divide, yeah,
which I've not seen. What's that like?
It's good. I like it. It's a little pedestrian. In my opinion, I just think the director is Michael Apted's directed it.
Right. Yeah.
Who I like as a director, but I just But it was a little pedestrian, and it's funny, isn't it? How some films just feel dated and others don't, and this one, it just feels a little bit slow. It's it's meant to be a screwball comedy, but I think maybe it just wasn't a good fit for Michael Apted. He just wasn't. The comedy, the snappy kind of dialogue just didn't quite come through, in my opinion. I don't think Kasdan was hugely enamored with it. He wasn't enamored with most adaptations of his work, actually. But of course, that's what got him the job writing Raiders originally, because it was I think officially it was Amblin's first film, Continental Divide, even though I think it didn't yet have the Amblin logo and the sort of the reputation it does now. But it was the first time Spielberg had produced something, I believe. But of course the hope was Spielberg would direct, and in the end he didn't. But of course it led on to plenty of good things for Kasdan. So he was broadly satisfied, even if he didn't love.
So the Raiders is the first time he sort of like has his brush with greatness, if you like, and more than that, I mean, In the Room, sits down, and I think you make a very convincing case that his contribution is huge to Raiders. I like the fact as well that his writing of the screenplay, he sort of produces almost like a bookish version of the screenplay. It reads almost like a novel in terms of the density.
Yeah, certainly it's really interesting to see the first draft, especially. It's 160 or 70 pages long, maybe more, 180. Clearly very long. He had 6 months to write it, and and I think he took his time with it, and it came out as, I wouldn't, clearly it's a screenplay. There's no doubt about it, but it's very, very dense paragraphs, very dense scene descriptions, especially, and quite literary in its style, which really struck me. And of course, I think if ever you read more recent, particularly action screenplays, it's almost like a game how few words you can use to describe something. It tends to be very sparse and quick, and of course the idea is to keep the reader wanting to read the next line. But in Kasdan's case, I think he just had faith in the words, and it is a really it's a really fun read. It's an interesting read. It's not boring at all. There's a few parts. There's a whole section set in China, which of course wasn't in the final movie, and it's just a really good, exciting read. Even though it doesn't look like how we would expect an action screenplay. It's very dense, And of course, I think something else is that he just wasn't that experienced there. And of course, this was probably his first real action that he'd written. So perhaps he didn't know the tricks he's supposed to know, but I'm guessing slightly here. But so he wrote it as he would write anything else, and I think it's all the better for it. It's very, very descriptive, very it really drags you into the story, not because it's a quick read, but because it's an interesting.
When I was reading your chapter, and I was thinking and reading the excerpts from the screenplay and thinking about it, I remember a conversation I had with a producer once where they said you rewrite a screenplay a number of times and you're always rewriting it for someone. So the first time you write it for producer to get involved, and then you probably have to rewrite it with the director to change it to their vision, and then you'll have to rewrite it for the actor to some degree, because as the casting goes in, they'll want certain things and they'll have certain strengths to do. It's just interesting that the screenplay that you end up making will be very different from the one the producer might signed off on. But it's not about that. You're not writing a screenplay for the final film. I mean, I think you quote someone talking about, the screenplay is a blueprint for the film. It's like, no, that's not how it works. The film isn't a building that needs to be consistently the same from beginning to end. It's an organic process that goes on. So when I was reading, this is a very long way of saying, when I was reading it, it struck me that Kasdan had basically sat in a room with Spielberg, very much taken their measure as two intelligent storytellers who very much knew what they wanted. And he wanted to give them that, but also give them that in such a colorful and interesting way that they would go, oh, this guy gets it. We see what here. I can see these shots. So even the scene descriptions have a sort of Spielbergian sort of thing to them that, he's understood the assignment, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think so. Very insightful reading of it. And I feel that it really is interesting to see how much, even of his first draft, is clearly in Spielberg's final film. So on the one hand, clearly Spielberg did trust him and was willing to go along with what Kasdan had written as he'd written it. But also, of course, as you say, there's probably a big factor is that Kasdan recognized what Spielberg needed and worked towards him as well. And certainly, of course, with Raiders, Spielberg was kind of on a tight leash. He'd gone over budget, over schedule on everything he'd done basically before then. So his promise to George Lucas was to do it under budget. And I think it really, it turned out serendipitously that Kasdan and Spielberg were a really good fit at that time, because Kasdan's writing, he seemed to know exactly what he needed, what Spielberg needed. And Spielberg probably needed a script that was tight, that was clear, or maybe tight's the wrong word if it's 170 pages, but in terms of the scenes were very tight, very well put together. The action scenes were really, really clear, exactly who does what and when. And I think it's something Spielberg rightly gets a lot of credit for, is in his action. It's so easy to understand. I do find myself in some action scenes in some films kind of switching off for a few minutes and just seeing how it ends up, whereas with Spielberg, they're very clear. And I think Kasdan's script really worked towards that. It made it very, very clear. And Spielberg could almost, it's unfair to say just follow it easily, because there's a lot to be done, but they were a very good fit for each other. And as you say, which perhaps I hadn't really considered, is that a lot of that wasn't just that Spielberg was following Kasdan's script, but also Kasdan probably intuited what was needed in that moment.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing about the length of the screenplay as well is, obviously the length isn't dialogue, it's scene. You can shrink that you'd say that's not it. Usually the rule is a minute a page. But if it's a scene description, that's not a minute, because that's you're seeing it anyway. The change in relationship, I think, is really interesting that you see throughout your book. So I love the idea that you see him asking these questions and being really interested, and but also very much playing the junior creative partner in that very first sort of script conference. And then by the time you get to Return of the Jedi, and we'll go back and talk about other things as well. By the time you get to Return of the Jedi, he's really quite forcefully arguing for the death of a main character in order to give the story weight. And I find, and then of course by the time you get to the end of his connection with Star Wars and Lucasfilm, he's actually firing director off the set of his film. Something feels awful about. But so that it's just really interesting to, almost if you're looking at his career as a character arc, to see that trajectory that he's taking.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that some of that kind of attracted me to it. When you asked me why Kasdan, I think, as I said, when I really came into the project was just around Force Awakens. And there was a real sense, like even as I began writing the first few lines, there was just a sense of a real circle there. He starts off with Lucasfilm, and now he's back at Lucasfilm, but obviously in a very, very different role. And and again, I think that's something which really appealed to me the whole way through was the sense. And of course, anyone as they get more experience, they get older, they have more responsibility in any job. But it was especially interesting given that Star Wars would almost always be credited George Lucas, and Raiders George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and Kasdan was kind of in the background, certainly in terms of reviews or outside writing about those films. So the fact then that he ended up being one of the big players, I think was it did make for it makes for a good story. There's no two ways of putting it, and I think it's one that perhaps he didn't always feel comfortable with. I mean, as you say, he felt he clearly did not enjoy the whole situation on Solo, where he was part of the decision to fire directing it at first. But of course, the fact that he was such a big part of that, not only was he a big part of it, but in the newspaper and magazine articles about it, he was talked about as a big part of it. I think that was almost as important as his actual role. That now, not only within the industry, but also, industry watchers were seeing that Lawrence Kasdan is an important figure within Lucasfilm, within Star Wars, and of course, almost by definition, within Hollywood.
It's almost as a sort of Game of Thrones-ish element to it. No, that's maybe the wrong analogy, but in the sense that Star Wars became so big that figures who would normally be relatively unknown to the public, or people like Ben Burt, would become massively important as it progressed, and there would be. It's a little bit like now when a character actor in Britain dies, and it's like Harry Potter star dies, and it's like, that's not the thing that they did that was the best thing.
Richard Harris is a Harry Potter actor.
Yeah, precisely. It's just I mean, Star Wars, the phenomenon that it is, becomes so huge. There is a sense that, yes, it elevates you and it gives you a lot of money and it puts you in positions to make things you want to make. But it also has the possibility of sort of swallowing your career entirely.
Yeah, and also, Kasdan was certainly very wary of that. I asked him actually specifically about that, and whether he was worried after Raiders and then Empire Strikes Back, which he got that job on the day that he submitted his first draft of Raiders, but then he did Return of the Jedi really as a favor, because Lucas had helped him out with Body Heat, kind of acting as a guarantor, his first film as director, and then Richard McQuan, the director of Jedi, he just said, look, we need Lawrence Kasdan. And so George Lucas asked, and Kasdan, even at the time, was very candid, just, yeah, I did it as a favor. I didn't really want to do it. But I said, well, were you still worried you put in that box? But he felt quite confident that he was, he had the ability. He already had Body Heat under his belt by that point, so that he would be able to kind of break out on his own. And clearly he was successful at that. But as I say earlier, I think it still kind of resonates much in the way of, Harry Potter actor Michael Gambon or Richard Harris. I think, Kasdan was always Star Wars writer Lawrence Kasdan, even when he was writing, Grand Canyon, for example. So it wasn't always a positive, even though he is aware that it did open doors.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid and every other movie was from the producers of Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah. And it would be like Quest for Fire. And you were going, wait a minute, I don't see any names I recognize on this. I'm not sure exactly how this is connected, but okay. Let's move on to his his non-Harry Potter films. Nah, I'm joking. His directorial debut, Body Heat, which I think it's interesting how many people could watch that film and love that film and be into that film and not really equate it with the others. I mean, I think it stands alone extremely well, and is, I mean, I sort of watch it and think of it as a neo-noir much more than I think of it as sort of like, the next thing he did after Raiders.
Yeah, I think it was quite a conscious decision to try and do something very, very different from those, from the Lucasfilm style adventures, and also it was, of course, his first film as director, and he said himself that he just thought that noir was a good fit. It was something he loved in watching movies when he was younger, and he just he saw noir as something that's very kind of stylish and stylistic, and he thought it would be a good way to kind of, I guess, learn the ropes as a director by this film, which had sort of clear, I suppose, generic tropes in a way that are available to you. Not that he necessarily used all those tropes, but yeah, certainly he was attracted to noir partly for that reason. It was away from Star Wars and Raiders, but it was also interesting as a first time director.
And he's using a lot of visual language as well in this film. As a screenwriter, there's often, I watch Paul Schrader's films, and as much as some of them might be great, some of them not so much, you do get a feeling. I think he said this himself, especially with his early films, that he just hired a really good cinematographer, and he did the visual stuff, and Paul Schrader worked with the actors more. Here, you do get the feeling that Kasdan has a real grip on the visual style that he wants.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, as you do when writing these things. Broadly, I was watching films in chronological sequence, and then later went back to films. And of course, watching Body again after watching his other films through his career, it's quite different. It stands alone, not only from Raiders and Star Wars, but also from his other later films, in my opinion. Certainly, he's clearly kind of enjoying the fact that it's, as I say, it's noir, it's heightened, it's a little bit fantastic. The camera moves far more than in the films, and I think the story too is it's very, very, even though it's very much about the characters, there is clearly a plot. As much as he says that plot's the hardest thing, there is clearly a plot, which is perhaps quite different then from the later films, like etc. Which, don't get me wrong, there are stories, there things are happening, but they're not plot driven, certainly. So I think Body Heat for me is perhaps the film of his that I would enjoy watching again and again quite easily, because it is just so it's fun, it's ambitious, and even though it does have things to say in terms of kind of marginally successful people realizing they're actually not worth all that much after all, but I think also it wears it very lightly as well. And don't get me wrong, I love his later films as well, which perhaps discuss things a bit more explicitly. But I think Body Heat is the one that does it, with the most, or does it most lightly and most fluently.
It's got a really deep cast as well. You've got obviously Kathleen Turner and William Hurt as amazing starring roles, but a real deep bench with people like Ted Danson and Mickey Rourke turning up.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, I'd kind of forgotten that Mickey Rourke was in it, because again, I must have seen it last time 10, 15 years ago. Before then, I watched it as I was, doing it for my thesis and book, and I'd forgotten Mickey Rourke was in it.
It's a very early appearance, isn't it? He was in Heaven's Gate and a few other films before this.
He was just this sort of rising star. Of course, at that time, William Hurt wasn't a big star either. Kathleen Turner, wasn't at all. She'd been in soaps. So, as well as having this great cast, I think, he and his casting director deserves credit, I think, for the fact that, he does seem to have a very good eye for young actors. He's given debut or certainly early roles to a lot of people like, Mark Duplass more recently, Zooey Deschanel, when she was very young appeared. He clearly likes actors. He said that himself. He admires them like athletes, I think he said. He wanted to be an actor, actually, younger, so he's always really interested. Does seem to enjoy finding new faces and knows how to use them. Certainly William Hurt apparently could be quite a difficult man, but Kasdan, gave him longer rehearsal time than most Hollywood films would give. Really clearly worked with him a lot to make sure he was ready. He played 3-4 roles, so clearly actors liked Kasdan too.
Yeah, he's giving them a sort of good platform to work with. And then, as you say, I think very early on in the book, there's this quote that you give of Kasdan saying, I don't get to make films that often, so when I do, I always want to make a different one. And he's, he moves on to make The Big Chill, and you couldn't. From the titles, you immediately see these are diametrically opposed in some ways.
Yeah.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head to head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Yeah, although it must be said, I always get them mixed up when I'm talking. But the Big Chill.
The temperature duo.
Yeah. He needed a third one, the tepid something. But it feels wildly different in many ways, doesn't it? Again, it's very kind of loose. I think Kim Newman said it was plotless, which is completely understandable. I would argue there is something there, and of course I know Kim Newman wasn't actually literally saying there was no plot, but certainly it has that feeling, doesn't it? Big Chill. It's about characters in rooms, talking really, as opposed to Body Heat, had so much kind of so sexy and violent. But yeah, the Big Chill is so different. Of course, I think Kasdan saw it as an extension of Body Heat in that they were both talking about, again, the generation, that kind of malaise of 10, 12 years after college when you realize you're not as important as you thought you were, and in Body Heat that was dealt with slightly obliquely, but in Big Chill it was very much talked about of really, where are we now and what have we become, and of course I think, while for me Body Heat is perhaps the most watchable of all of his films as director, I think of course The Big Chill is the one that probably most people would associate with him in terms of his directorial.
I would argue it's probably his most influential. I mean, Kenneth Branagh copied it pretty much shot for shot in Peter's Friends.
Yes.
I mean, talking about that idea of plot and plotlessness, it reminds me a little bit of like a Robert Altman film where you just get a situation, and then you throw all the characters in, and the situation has a ritual and a chronology all its own, and you just need to see what those characters were in that. So a marriage, a wedding, I mean, well, there's a Robert Altman film, The Wedding, that has a very specific beginning and middle and end, but not because it's been plotted. The wedding itself provides that, and runs naturally. That feels like the way The Big Chill operates.
Yeah, I think it gives it a very clear, I guess, sort of underpinning, even if, again, broadly there's not a main plot, there's not lots of big events that happen, but of course, it does give it that nice underpinning, the fact they stay for the weekend. We know it's for the weekend, almost that provides its structure, doesn't it? As opposed to necessarily things happening, and of course in my book I talk a little about Kristen Thompson, her ideas about structure, and I'm not going to go into all the detail now because there's a lot to it, but she suggests the idea of the 3-act structure, which Robert McKee and all those will always talk about, but she suggests it's actually 4 acts, and it should be based not so much around plot points but around characters' motivations, and if you map that onto Big Chill, it makes sense as this 3 or 4 act movie. But of course, I mean, broadly, it certainly doesn't feel like lots of events are happening, and yet it's kind of funny when you summarize it. A hell of a lot does happen. There's affairs, and there's people sleeping with a married man sleeping with a woman who his wife is happy with, and another married woman sleeping with a man who perhaps her husband won't be happy with. All these things are going on, and I think again a lot does go back to rehearsal, which Kasdan is a big proponent of, and the fact that those characters, or those actors, spent a couple of weeks together, mostly living together, even they were making it, they were living in a couple of houses between the cast, but then of course spending lots of time beforehand rehearsing, and it just meant then that we could believe them as characters, and certainly for me, I think that's why I don't feel the need for the big the big second act twister, to change things. I'm happy being Eagles company, seeing where their interactions are going to take us.
I'm always a bit confused by this whole obsession that people have when it comes to screenplays, in terms of, and the names that you mentioned, interesting mix of academic who are coming out of sort of structuralism and sort of screenwriting manual, right, or sort of trying to help people, if you want to put a generous spin on it, or trying to just make a book. If I just, there's a bit of me that is either, so what, it's like a Fibonacci sequence, there's structure in everything. So, someone spotting it is not a big deal as far as I'm concerned. What does it help us in terms of understanding? I'm not denying it's there. I'm not saying that, things don't share structure. And it always comes with exceptions, which also makes it slightly, often the things that are the exceptions are the things that end up being more successful, because for the very point that they surprise us. Oh no, you've killed the main character off halfway through, or Jaws, or suddenly you're doing something, we're in a different movie halfway through.
Yeah, my sense with discussing structure and 3 or 4 acts, etc., is, I think for me there's value in looking at films that exist and seeing how they work, but not in terms of saying this is how a film should be made or be written. I think for me that is where I certainly digress from McKee, etc. I am very wary of the idea of this is how screenwriters should write films, because of course, as you say, it's often the exceptions which are so great, and also I just think it is just very limiting to look in those terms. I do see some value, and again, I try not to devote too much time to it in my book, but I see some value in certainly films like The Beagle, and I guess the films which are the exception, to try to look a bit more deeply and just to say, well, is there a plot, or yes or no, or what is it that's driving these characters? Because of course it could go the other way, where you might have something that's so loose as to not mean anything, and certainly for me, after the fact, analyzing of plots, can have value in an academic way. I'm not suggesting that anyone who watches a film has to go away and think carefully exactly where the first act ends and the second act starts. But I think it can be interesting to look at that. As Thompson, she wasn't saying this is how films should be written. She was saying, here's some films and let's have a look at how they're structured, because it might be interesting to see what, not in terms of what works and what doesn't for future writers, but in terms of, as we analyze any art, in terms of what is interesting, I suppose asking why, even though often the answer is we don't really know. And I'm sure, I didn't engage Kasdan on this question particularly, but I'm fairly sure, let's not say Kasdan, but I'm fairly sure most writers aren't thinking quite in terms, this must be the moment when, but of course, and that's where, again, I don't like screenwriting manuals that seem to think that because there's a formula, you must do it, as opposed to here's a formula which can be useful. And certainly I'm not, I'm not pushing that argument forward at all, I hope. But I do think it is interesting to apparently plotless film and to try and see, if there's structure and why and how it works, because clearly it does work. It's such a popular film and such an important film. It's one that's resonated through the case.
In a way, in a sense, I think that sort of connects to influence, because it influences not just other films, but because of its sort of structure / lack of structure, or plot / lack of plot, it gives itself over to things like TV shows. So I think that the fact that it's an ensemble, the fact that it's dealing with generational change, I think you don't really get things like 30-something without the big chill. I think that there's an idea even today that something like Friends, actually today, something like Friends, it's not today, it's not today, is it?
It's still today, isn't it? I think
it's on Netflix, so everything's today. But that idea of a group of people, and you're looking at them and their platonic relationships to some degree, and to other degrees it's almost always about the impossibility of platonic relationships, because there's story right there. Somebody has to end up sleeping with somebody else to drive the story. Which brings us to sort of looking at his other one of his other great sort of films in this sort of genre, which was Grand Canyon, which you kind of, from the marketing, is almost like posited as a kind of sequel or spiritual heir to, I mean, you quote the marketing which says, he brought us the Big Chill in the 80s, and now this is the 90s, from the filmmaker. I think you mentioned earlier sort of generational. I watched this film at the cinema, I think, and I remember being really struck by Steve Martin as well, as sort of seeing him act in a way that was totally different to what I was used to. What was your first experience of the movie?
Yeah, I saw it on TV. I'm guessing late teens, early 20s when I saw it. And I think I'd seen LA Story quite, a fairly similar time, even though it was probably many years after both films had been released. And of course, LA Story, also Steve Martin. And of course, very, very.
So it's more comic, but still not just out and out comic.
Yeah. But of course, in Grand Canyon, he was, to be honest, I think his character still has, comic elements to him. He's this very kind of broad, movie director. But of course, it is broadly a dramatic role. And I think it was Steve Martin's first dramatic role, which, again, to go back to rehearsal, at that time, Kasdan was considering not doing rehearsals because these characters didn't know each other. A lot of them, they're having scenes separately. But then because of Steve Martin being new to drama, I think it was Steve Martin who wanted, who asked for rehearsal. And so Kasdan did go back to, what he usually, and yeah, so in terms of, to compare it to The Big Chill, it's funny because it is very much seen as the other big, again, the term boomer, I can't stress enough, I'm not using it in the sort of the derogatory sense. It's just the name of that generation, which Kasdan clearly belonged to and it has exemplified. But it's sort of so Grand Canyon is very much seen as successor to The Big Chill, but such a different film, of course. But both I think are funny. But Grand Canyon certainly it's against this backdrop of LA in late 80s, early 90s, and I know Kasdan said that it was only a few months before before the riots in 1991 that it came out, and Kasdan said he could you could sense it. Anyone in LA could sense something was happening. So in a way it was quite prescient, I think, that he made this film, which wasn't now just in the kind of the bubble of alma mater of University of Michigan. It was not alma mater, alumni of University of Michigan. It was now kind of yes, well-to-do professional white people and families, but then how they interacted, I guess, with a black family and with with other people in LA, and as I said, they weren't the same place as network and relationship. So of course, it ended up being a very different film, a much more heightened film, of course, just because there was that undercurrent of fear. There were in the film there's a drive-by shooting. You wouldn't see that in The Big Chill. So it was, I think, really, really interesting to see the differences, in 8 years apart. But now you're looking at, I guess, that generation when now they have families and again, teenage kids who are going out into the world on their own. And again, in that backdrop of LA, in the early 90s, probably felt quite a scary thing to be doing. And certainly that was, how Kasdan and his wife, Meg Kasdan, they wrote it together. And that's how they, devised it really, as it came about because they were, they were feeling that sense of dread as their children were becoming teenagers or adults and going out into the world on their own.
It strikes me as well when I was reading the book about the comparison between Body Heat and Grand Canyon as well, that there's this sort of swelteringness, this paranoia. There are sort of the most obvious is this is an extension of The Big Chill, but there is also some of Body Heat in there, just in terms of that atmosphere, that darkness.
It's something in both those films is these kind of I guess acts of God which the characters have to be afraid of. So in Body Heat, it's literally the heat, which is making people act in different ways, as Oscar the cop says in Body Heat, people act differently. And then in Grand Canyon, you've got these moments which are really out of the character's hands. So we have nearly being hit by a bus or by a car, and we have an earthquake, and these things, these elements, even if it's not literally violence, and of course in Grand Canyon you do have drive-by shootings, but even moments which aren't necessarily violent, but it's scary. And I think there's a suggestion in Grand Canyon that yes, you have to be worried about yourself, about what your family does, but then you're also thinking about so many things out of our hands. And certainly I think that came from Kasdan and his wife. So he and his wife wrote the script together, and they were really concerned about their children now growing up, going out into the world as teenagers and adults. And of course, that again is very generational. It's that time when as parents you see your kids growing up.
Yeah, I was just thinking as well as when we were speaking I've mentioned Altman earlier on. Of course, you've got Shortcuts as another great LA movie around about this time, and Magnolia. I mean, it really fits into that sort of group of movies about LA, and also that's related to plot as well. LA is often seen as a city without a center. It's a city of suburbs upon suburbs, layers upon layers, stretching out horizontally rather than vertically. So there's also that also. Look at me, the structuralist. having decried structuralism, I'm all for it. Oh, I'm also thinking of the documentary Los Angeles Plays Itself, which is a wonderful.
So and I think you make a good point there about LA as this. It's a strangely unique city in the US, I think. Strangely, of all people, I think it was Andre Previn in his book who talked about how most cities in the US can all feel quite similar, but I think he said it was New York and San Francisco are the only two that are different. But I would argue LA perhaps more so, just because it is, as you say, it's a flat horizontal place, and of course it's a place perhaps more than the other which is full of people coming in from various other places. We can't hide from the fact all of those films are made by filmmakers. So of course they've all come usually from other parts of the US to make these films, in LA, and it is an interesting character, I think, in all those films you mentioned, and certainly in Grand Canyon. As far as I remember, it's the only one of his films where it's set in LA. I'm sure I'm missing something very obvious, but I don't think so. And it does make for this kind of interesting, as I say, this kind of network narrative where like different people are in different places, but their lives are, are connected. Sometimes just by watching the same basketball game on TV. Of course, sometimes by chance events, as the whole film is balanced on late at night.
So we're coming to the end, and there was a real sense in the interview that ends the book, and also in the final chapter of the book, that Kasdan is sort of feeling his career is kind of over, that he's written his last screenplay. He's not sure he's got the energy to do another one. That last film was Solo, which I think it would be fair to say wasn't necessarily going out on a high in terms of its critical reception. I wasn't a huge fan when I saw it. I'll always be interested by the missed possibility of a Miller Lord version, although I did think the explanation for why they were fired in the book and how he describes it was the most reasonable I've heard. I mean, it was like, oh, okay, if you're not going to stick to the screenplay, I guess you're going to get fired after a while.
Certainly for me, I enjoyed Solo. I think certainly more than you did, I think, and I think as a finale to certainly his screenwriting career, and I think it's important to stress that he's still making documentaries, and certainly he tends to make more, but certainly in features it would appear that that's it. And I think as a screenplay, I would argue it's quite a fitting end, just because it sort of manages to squeeze in so many Kasdanites, to use a term which one critic used, but so many Kasdanite elements in terms of the Western elements, a bit of noir to it as well. I mean, obviously the sort of the fun aspects of Star Wars, and certainly I would argue Kasdan, more than any writer in Star Wars, is the one who manages to keep it I suppose grounded is a word. It's the wrong word in Star Wars, but manages to make it feel like it's about people as opposed to about this big battle or this big event. So I think in many ways it works quite well as a curtain call. I think it is a shame that obviously the controversy during production, that perhaps overshadowed things a little. And certainly Kasdan said, and I would tend to agree, that the timing was very strange. Like they were releasing films, Star Wars films, every Christmas, and then suddenly this one they did just 5 months after The Last Jedi, which had quite a mixed response. And so timing wise, it wasn't really well marketed. I think it was a week or two after Endgame was released, which of course didn't help either. So and I think Kasdan understandably wasn't very happy with that, and I would argue that did affect its how it was received. I do think if it was released maybe 6 months later, it would have been seen differently. I think instead it came with the baggage of Last Jedi, which has kind of divided audiences, and then also the baggage of the Lord and Miller and then Ron Howard taking over. But personally, I think it's a decent film and a decent script.
I'll put it this way: reading your book definitely made me want to rewatch it, and that's always a good thing. It made me want to go back to it. I saw it. I didn't see it necessarily in the best circumstances because I saw it at Cannes, so it was a premiere. So you're seeing it in with films either side, which are maybe have more vaulting ambition, and then I went straight to the party where Ron Howard was, and the stars, and Denis Villeneuve was there, and a whole bunch of people. And I remember there was a very funny thing because I was kind of getting into the party, was already like getting into a VIP room, but then there was a VIP room in the party that obviously you're not going to get into, but the buffet table was the same, right? Except that you're on one side of the buffet table and the VIPs are on the other. And I was going down the thing, picking things, and Ron Howard was going down the other side. And we were just coinciding. And we kept looking up at each other and going, what do you think of this? So that's my solo story. That's
there we are. That's impressive. Kath actually brought up the Cannes premiere in our interview. I didn't put it in the book just for space, but yeah, he just said that was just a terrible idea to have it at Cannes. Audiences there broadly hate these kinds of movies, and it just wasn't a good fit. And I think again, it's certainly from Kasdan's point of view, it fed into this idea that Disney just weren't handling it in the right way at all. And not for a minute to say that Disney has no reason for one of their own films to fail, but it really felt like they wanted it to.
Right.
They did everything wrong when it came to marketing, including like Kasdan said, going to Cannes was just the worst idea.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I think that, although Attack of the Clones had gone there, it wasn't the first Star Wars to sort of launch there as a sort of gala, not as it's obviously not in competition or anything like that. But even that, even sort of saying, even giving it an out of competition slot is kind of like saying this isn't good enough. We can't put this in competition. We'd be laughed out of. The one thing I wanted to go back to, just this is a final question because I know we're running over a little bit, but it's just such a fascinating book and a fascinating topic. I'm a really big fan of Wyatt Earp. And I find Kasdan's love of the Western, Silverado, of course, is another example of him trying valiantly to bring the Western through in the 80s. And I think Wyatt Earp, although it went against Tombstone, and Tombstone won that battle on a contemporary basis, I think Wyatt Earp really stands the test of time. I think it really stands up as a...
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, again, rewatching a few years, and I rewatched Tombstone as well, just for some kind of a context. And I can absolutely see why, at the time in '94, why Tombstone would have been a more popular film. It was short, it was snappy, it was fun. It's a good, it's a good fun Western. But I think, as you say, I think Wyatt Earp actually tells that story a lot better. Perhaps maybe too comprehensively. However, I'm someone who always likes a good 3-hour historical epic, and and I think it does stand the test of time much more. Again, that notion of being dated, and it's funny how even a Western can feel dated. And to me, Tombstone, and don't get me wrong, I enjoyed it, but it does feel very much of its time. Whereas Wyatt Earp could have been made in the 60s, 70s today, and I think there's just a bit of a shame that it was probably now it would be, a 10-part, 6 parts, HBO or Netflix thing. And if it had a bit more, maybe if it was made today, it would. And it was originally conceived as a mini series before Kasdan was involved, I believe, but then became the film. And I think it got caught between two stools, perhaps a little. It had the feeling of this mini series with obviously many parts of his life, which of course there's no reason why that can't work as a film. But then of course at time it lacked some of that, I guess, urgency or of Tombstone, which a quicker, shorter period of his life as well. But but certainly Kasdan's westerns generally is something I wish actually if I had one more chapter I would do more on his westerns, because I've written before about Silverado and about Wyatt Earp, and I think in both cases it's someone who loves westerns and someone who knows what makes them good, whether that is the longer kind of historical epic version in Wyatt Earp, or whether it's Silverado, which it was a more fun Saturday afternoon matinee kind of western. And certainly the way he talks about them, clearly it's something that he loved. And again, Silverado he wrote with his brother Mark, and they just sat down and said, right, let's think of all the things that we love in westerns and just try and put them in. And it was kind of similar in some ways to the Raiders story conference, in that they were deciding what kind of things they'd like to see and then structuring the story around those. And I think it shows just that the fun they had with Silverado. Again, Wyatt's a slightly different beast, but certainly I think two good westerns.
Dennis Quaid as well is amazing. I think
Yes.
Val Kilmer is good, and he's become sort of iconic. But I think there's a real injustice that Dennis Quaid's performance is sort of forgotten. Really effing good. It's really good.
Yeah.
And Costner's great. I think this is the kind of role that Costner is perfect in, because he is kind of boring and he is kind of
he's still
solid, And if you haven't seen it, his Horizon. Definite. I think Costner's westerns, Horizon and Open Range, are both very influenced by Kasdan. I think there's a very, I think he's taken his experience of Wyatt Earp, everything he's done after that, he gave him the template.
Yeah, it's a good point. And and of course they were very, very close as well and worked together.
He was in The Big Chill.
Times. Yeah. you see his slit wrist.
He was the coldest part of The Big Chill. Well, listen, Brett, thank you so much for your time. So one final question, which is, what would be your recommended film book for our listeners?
Yeah, I thought about this, and I think every book I thought of or have read recently are ones that you've had on here. So Lauren Buckland's book on Citizen Kane, Ed Zwick's book, of course, talking of 30-something earlier, which I really enjoyed, and also Joseph McBride's book on Billy Wilder. And I suppose that kind of inspired me for another book that maybe you haven't mentioned on here, which is Mr. Wilder and Me by Jonathan Coe.
Excellent.
And kind of left field in that it's not factual. It's a fictionalized version of a real event. But it tells a story of a young British Greek woman, actually based on a real person who was a man, but she ends up working with Wilder on one of the last films, Fedora, as a translator in Greece, and then they go to Germany and Austria after. And I think it's just such it's one of those books that even a slow reader like me will read in 2 or 3 sittings, because it's just it's just delightful. It's really, really lovely. But it also, I suppose good fiction can do with factual topics, in that it manages to convey a lot of the kind of melancholy, I suppose, at the end of Wilder's career, as he realizes he's not as important as perhaps, well, in film terms, as he had been in the past. But he's still this, vibrant, interesting artist who wants to do more. And it's really lovely. It doesn't feel sad. It feels positive. It's life affirming. So I recommend Mr. Wilder and Me, but the way you're nodding suggests you've read it too. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I concur. Absolutely concur. There's a beautiful scene in a restaurant where they're, they invite her to sit down and they're having dinner, and it's just like, in a half-empty restaurant, and it's like nobody's coming over to talk to him anymore. It's
yeah.
In fact, he wants to grab someone to talk to because he's still got stories to tell, and that's so symptomatic of that part of his career. But wonderful, it's a wonderful suggestion, wonderful read. I should get Jonathan Coe onto the podcast. That would be a good get. You'd be a good guest.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah. I look forward to
that. Hey, you know how tenacious I am, Brett. I'll get him.
Go for it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brett. It's been wonderful talking to you, and it's been wonderful sort of having a think about this filmmaker who you justly, your book absolutely proves that he is someone who really needs to be thought of and looked at in the same breath as people like Barry Levinson and Robert Zemeckis and all those other filmmakers of his generation.
Well, thank you, John. Well, thank you for having me, and it's been lovely to talk about it too. So thank you.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.